When choosing exercises, the best thing to do really is learn what makes an exercise good, or maybe I should say effective, because often exercises aren't inherently good or bad, because that just depends on why you're doing them. You can then apply what you know to every individual instance and make good choices. However, I understand sometimes people don't want to learn how to fish, sometimes they just want the fish, right? So today, I'm going to be a fish salesman, fishmonger, fish dealer. In other words, I'm going to run through some like-for-like exercises and I'm going to tell you which I think is better and why. So really, I am going to be giving you fish, but also subtly slipping in some fishing lessons, mate. I'm going to stop talking about fish and start talking about exercises. Seated leg curl versus lying leg curl. We'll get the least glamorous one out of the way first. Let's face it, not many people really care too much about hamstrings, but it's worth including in this video because it's one of the few on this list where there's actual research directly comparing the two. Here, the seated version comes out on top, and this is thought to be down to the hip flexion, placing the hamstrings in a more stretched position. And that's a theme that you can apply to a lot of exercises that involve muscles that cross more than one joint. You can place one joint in a position that stretches the muscle whilst performing the main action with the other joint. And we'll see another example of that in the next exercise on this list. Now, this study was only on 20 people, but it was an intra-subject study, meaning that subjects used one limb for seated curls and the other for lying curls or prone curls. And the difference was actually quite significant, especially given that this was only over 12 weeks. I think over a lifetime, this could result in quite a big difference. So I'd say that's certainly worth taking notice of. Overhead tricep extension versus push downs. Again, there is direct research comparing the two specifically in regard to hypertrophy, and the overhead extension is the clear winner here. I think a cable overhead extension is a pretty good choice because it's easy and quick to set up, doesn't involve smashing yourself in the cranium with heavy objects, and it has a good amount of resistance for most of the rep. An easy bar behind the head extension is also a good choice, and lying dumbbell skull crushers are another. Because the long head of the tricep originates on the scapula, extending the elbow whilst in shoulder flexion again means it's working at a longer length than it would be if the arms were down by the side in a cable pushdown. And much like the previous exercise, this is thought to be why the overhead extensions result in more gains. I have also seen a theory that being upright with your arms overhead could result in slightly restricted blood flow, meaning that you're almost doing a gentle form of occlusion training, and that could also be an argument for a standing overhead extension rather than a lying overhead extension. I'm not really sure how true that is, just a theory, mate, who knows, I don't know anything. Chest supported row versus unsupported or bent over row. Really, we could put a lot of exercises in here, but I think this is a good example to illustrate a point. If your goal is to grow a specific muscle, in this case, the muscles of the mid and upper back, then that muscle should be the limiting factor. That means that if you were to train to failure, it would be that muscle that fails first. The issue with unsupported row movements is that you require quite a heavy weight, and then the fatigue that accrues in your erectors often becomes limiting. If you choose the same weights and compare your performance on a bent over row against a chest supported row, you'll probably see quite a big difference. Even if your lower back muscles don't fail, that fatigue often forces you into different angles, not to mention the general fatigue from stabilizing what can be a fairly heavy weight, which obviously results in needing longer rest periods. For these reasons, I would stick predominantly to supported row movements. Now, it's not always another muscle per se, that's the limiting factor. Sometimes it could be your cardiovascular fitness if you're doing some walking lunges, or it could be something like your grip, which might technically be your muscles, but that's why people sometimes use straps to deadlifts or do pull-ups, because if they don't, their grip might fail before they can adequately train what they're actually trying to train. Lever leg press versus sled leg press. These next few exercises are about trying to challenge the targeted muscle throughout the greatest range of motion. Now, this is a touch niche, but there are some subtle differences between these two leg press machines, and I think the lever leg press has two main advantages. This sled leg press has the weight on a track and at a fixed angle, which means the resistance is constant throughout the whole rep. This one has the plates moving in an arc with a more horizontal portion at the bottom or the start of the rep and a more vertical portion at the top, meaning it's slightly easier at the bottom and slightly harder at the top. This aligns better with your strength throughout the rep, where the start of the rep is typically the hardest part on these types of movements and the lockout is usually the easiest. So if your goal is to complete full reps with as heavy weight as possible, this synergy between resistance curve and the strength curve is what will allow best for that. The secondary advantage, I'd say, is the rotation of the foot plate. That allows for some slight plantar flexion at the bottom of the rep. Often with squat, lunge, leg press type movements, ankle mobility can actually end up limiting the overall range of motion, so having this slight movement in the foot plate can result in a deeper rep. I'm going to run through the next 4 all together because they're all essentially the same logic, and we have 3 options for each. At the bottom of each list, so last priority, would be the free weight versions: dumbbell lateral raises, dumbbell chest fly, dumbbell rear delt fly, and preacher curl. For all of these, there are portions of the rep where there's almost zero resistance. That's just a consequence of matching up gravity, which pulls straight down, with single joint exercises that move weight in an arc. The eagle-eyed among you might then ask, why is uneven resistance good in the leg press example, but bad for these? And that really comes down to 2 things. One, how uneven. There shouldn't be any part of a rep that's easy. And 2, how closely the resistance throughout the rep aligns to your strength throughout the rep. Each of these exercises has portions that would still be easy even if you were failing at the hardest part. Side note, because of where the resistance mainly occurs, a couple of these actually aren't bad exercises, but you might as well just stick to some partial reps. A better alternative is the cable version. These offer a more even resistance throughout, but it's still not perfectly constant. Here, your resistance depends on how far the actual weight stack travels in relation to the movement at the joint. This is why you can get slightly different resistance curves by crossing and uncrossing your hands when doing cable lateral raises. And this is pretty nice superset for anyone who wants to try it, by the way. The best option for each is the machine version, so sorry free weight crowd, sometimes machines are good. So we have lateral raise machine, pec deck, reverse pec deck, and the preacher curl machine. Now we have machines that move about a point, and we're using limbs that do the same. So we have reps that are challenging throughout. I'm not going to say we're getting even resistance here because A, we know that would only be a good thing if our strength throughout the rep was constant, and B, we're actually often still not, because the cam part of the machine is rarely perfectly round. If it's a well-designed machine, however, it will have a shape that better suits your strength curve, and some even have adjustable cams so you can manipulate the resistance curve manually. One major caveat to this is the fact that poorly designed machines do exist. Sometimes you get on a machine and it just doesn't feel right, so don't feel like you have to persevere if that's the case. Just do cables or even the free weight version. You're still going to make gains. Finally, let's just have one ab exercise. Here we're going to replace our leg raises or hanging leg raises with a reverse crunch on an inclined bench. This is just a case of understanding the action that the target muscle performs. Whilst leg raises will work your abs, it's primarily isometrically, and for the most part you're just working your hip flexors. If you want to develop your abs, a good cue is to think about moving these 2 points closer together, whether that's a typical top-down crunch or a reverse crunch. I like the reverse crunch because you can get a bit of back arch at the bottom of the rep, which stretches out your abs, much like you can with a cable kneeling crunch, which you don't really get with typical incline crunches. So you're stretching out your abs and then crunching them together. I understand that strengthening your core more generally is often what people are trying to do, but if we're talking specifically about trying to develop visual abs, then this swap will make a difference. Before you go, let me just highlight one quite important point. Although when looked at in isolation, you could say that some of these exercises are just better than the others, there is always a third option. Do both. Now that's not always the best option, but it's always an option worth considering. First, because there are other factors that might affect things. Do you want to wait for somebody to finish on the seated leg curl when you could just jump on and do some lying leg curls and then get on with your life? But also because sometimes exercises can stimulate hypertrophy in different areas of a muscle. So although the bottom line of a study might say 50% more total quad growth from this exercise, there could still be areas of the quads where the worse exercise resulted in more growth. And in that case, if you want to grow the whole quads, it still could be worth incorporating that worse exercise to some extent, although that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a 50-50 split. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed your fish. See you later. Promise I'll never use the fish analogy again. I've used that quite a few times.
Joey Lenny is my hero.